Hello and welcome to Vices and Volumes, a fortnightly podcast where I explore my collection of 19th century books, uncovering the scandalous, the ordinary and the unexpectedly human stories hidden inside their pages. My name is Avril Clinton Ford and I'll be your host and guide. In this episode we're exploring the pursuit of perfection Victorian style, and who better to guide us than Lady Colin Campbell, a woman who wrote extensively about becoming the perfect lady while simultaneously being dragged through a scandal of the century. In 1844, she published The Perfect Lady in Cassell's Family Magazine and advised young women on every microscopic detail of proper behaviour. But 2 years later, she'd be in court, her intimate life dissected in newspapers. We'll explore the impossible standards she outlined, the terror of entertaining society, the performance of politeness, the minefield of marriage and the domestic ideal. This is Lady Colin Campbell's world of perfection in all its complicated and occasionally devastating glory. Gertrude Elizabeth Blood was born on the 3rd of May 1857 in County Clare, Ireland. The daughter of an Irish landowner Edmund Mallon Blood and Mary Ann Ferguson, she spent much of her childhood in Italy due to her father's poor health, receiving a liberal, multilingual upbringing that was very unusual for a woman of her era. In October 1880, at the age of just 23, she met Lord Colin Campbell, the fifth son of the 8th Duke of Argyll, while visiting friends in Scotland. They became engaged within 3 days. It was a fairy tale beginning that would turn into a nightmare. Lord Colin was suffering from what was likely syphilis, though he concealed the true nature of his illness from his bride. They married in July 1881, but the marriage was delayed several times due to his health. They didn't consummate the relationship until 1881, after he falsely told her that his doctor had declared him cured. Within months, Gertrude contracted the disease from her husband. By 1883, she'd begun writing for the Saturday Review, and in 1884, the same year, she obtained a judicial separation on the grounds of cruelty. Cassell's Family Magazine published her articles on The Perfect Lady. The opening piece appeared in the 1884 annual that sits on my shelf, and it begins with remarkable self-awareness. Who can lay claim to such a title as this, which comprehends so much within its limits? Lady Colin Campbell understood the terror of entering society. She opens her first article by describing young women standing half reluctant to go forward, not knowing what to do, looking shy, embarrassed, uncomfortable, and fearful of committing some blunder. This wasn't a metaphorical anxiety, this was the reality of emerging from the schoolroom into society, where every action would be subject to the observation and criticism of those amongst whom she moves. The stakes were existential. According to historian Lenore Davidoff, writing in The Best Circles, Society, Etiquette and the Season, 1973, presentation at court and the London season were the mechanism by which the daughters of the elite were brought to market. The marriage market, that is. Jessica Garrett, in her 1994 study Country House Life, Family and Servants 1815 to 1914, found that for landed gentry families, daughters' successful marriages were often essential to maintaining estate finances. A single social misstep could derail everything. Lady Colin Campbell makes this devastatingly clear. As a consequence of these feelings and visible quakings, they appear to singular disadvantage. This shyness or embarrassment gives an impression to the onlookers of stupidity or awkwardness. The observers weren't kind. They were judging marriage prospects, assessing family wealth, determining who belonged and who didn't. It reminds one of the sales at Tattersall's. But here is where it becomes truly crushing. She describes another type of girl who thinks she has no need of instruction, or who does not care to receive it, but rushes on the arena in full confidence and self-satisfaction, determined to be regardless of what people say or think about her. The reader expects approval for this confidence. Instead, Lady Colin Campbell offers only feelings of compassion. Even boldness was wrong. The obsession with the minute was not arbitrary, it was diagnostic. She had a list of imperfections. White-headed pins project from black dresses and black-headed pins from light-coloured dresses, where thread should render the services required. Ragged braid disfigures the edge of skirts. A button is missing here and there from the ranks. Creased and crumpled cloaks show signs of careless usage. Soiled collars and cuffs and frills which should be in the fire often encircle the neck and wrist. These weren't aesthetic preferences, they were class markers. According to C. Willett Cunnington's English Women and the Clothing in the 19th Century, 1937, a lady's dress in the 1880s required constant maintenance. Hem braiding needed replacing every few weeks. Collars and cuffs, detachable, made from white linen or lace, required daily washing and starching. This demanded either wealth, servants, or exhausting labour. Lady Colin Campbell understood the bind. Great expenditure of money on dress is not essential to perfection. Nicety and neatness of apparel, freshness and purity of lace or muslin, these are requisites. But achieving that freshness without money, Lady Colin Campbell may not have understood this quite as much as she thought. It was nearly impossible. Working class women earned roughly £20 to £30 a year as domestic servants in the 1880s. According to economic historian Sarah Horrell's research on Victorian wages, a lady's maid earned £15 to £25 annually. The cost of maintaining one lady's wardrobe, with daily washing, ironing, mending, and updating, could easily consume a servant's entire year's wages. The message embedded in those visible pins and soiled collars was clear. This woman lacks resources, and lacking resources meant diminished marriage prospects, which meant poverty was more likely, a vicious circle indeed. She continues with her catalogue of requirements. The perfect young lady will also be as particular about her dress when at home as when in company. One often hears it said, "It does not matter what we wear at home, anything will do." But it does matter. Why? Because perfection demanded consistency. Any slip, even at home, even unseen, risked becoming habit. Their surveillance was total, but increasingly it was also eternal. Lady Colin Campbell would turn in her grave if she saw what we wore at home today. Her second article, published later in 1884, tackles politeness with exhaustive specificity. Good and perfect manners are acquired by observation, by cultivation and practice. The neglect of these observances, you will find, is seldom pardoned by the world. That censorious autocrat exacts rigid deference to its opinions and strict conformity to its rules. The world as a censorious autocrat is an apt description. She begins with listening. Politeness requires that we listen to people who talk to us, or even when we are not interested in a conversation. I sometimes see young ladies visibly smother a yawn to show their indifference or distaste, and I hear them merely utter an apathetic yes or no. And sometimes I hear them interrupt the conversation rudely by abruptly introducing another topic. This wasn't about genuine engagement, it was about performing engagement convincingly, enough to avoid offence. According to Lawrence E. Klein's research on 18th and 19th century politeness in Shaftesbury and the Culture of Politeness, 1994, these elaborate codes served as gatekeeping mechanisms. The emerging middle class, eager to rise socially, had to master rules that seemed natural to those born into them, but required intensive study for the outsiders. Lady Colin Campbell continues, "Politeness requires that we do not stare at the dress of the person to whom we are talking. I notice that some ladies deliberately scan the attire of those whom they speak, from the crown to the head downwards. This is rudeness and therefore an imperfection." The irony is rich. Don't stare at dresses even though everyone is being judged by their dress. Pretend the very markers that determine social standing don't exist, while simultaneously ensuring that your own are flawless. Can you imagine the anxiety? Then comes the prohibitions. Politeness requires that when in company, communications should not be whispered, that tittering and giggling should not be indulged in, that remarks should not be made upon any person present, that we should not pass in front of anyone without an apology or talk across anyone. But here's where it becomes almost unbearable. She writes, "Politeness requires that we take no notice of eccentricity that it may appear in those we meet in company. A recognition of eccentricity or absurdity must not be shown by words, still less by a smile." And the examples she provides are magnificent. Oftentimes, it is a difficult matter to appear insensible to mistakes which are made or accidents which happen, especially when they are of a laughable nature. But control must be exercised out of consideration for the feelings of others, if for no other reason. When an old-fashioned handshaker keeps prolonged possession of your hand, and from time to time gives it a succession of convulsive shakes, when a lady walks the length of a long room unconscious that the wind has given her a grotesque appearance by blowing the feather in her bonnet rigidly upright, when the servant trips with a dish in their hand and the round cake upon it rolls off and bowls up the room, when a page slips and falls on his back amidst a shower of dinner rolls scattered around his prostrate form, when a manservant throws open the door and announces you to a room full of ordinary folk as Lady Balchinos, and your simple title is Miss Baldwin, when your friend's servant blackleads your boots, thus giving them an unusually curious and startling appearance as you send them forth from beneath your dress, whence walking along the streets. Whenever little incidents such as these occur, politeness demands that we neither speak nor smile at them at the time of occurrence. These scenarios are gloriously specific. The cake bowling up the room, the page surrounded by dinner rolls. One might suspect the Lady Colin Campbell had witnessed or experienced every one of these incidents. But notice what she's actually describing: the constant suppression of natural human response. And some of these women out in the world were very young indeed. Some ladies were married off from the age of 15 onwards. But if they saw something funny, they're not to smile. To see something absurd, they pretend they hadn't noticed. Someone mangles your name, you cannot react. The psychological discipline required was immense. According to historian Deborah Cohen in Family Secrets, Shame and Privacy in Modern Britain 2013, this is a read I very much recommend, Victorian middle and upper class life was characterised by elaborate performances of imperviousness. The ability to witness chaos while maintaining composure was itself a class marker. Working class people, the thinking went, couldn't control their reactions. But ladies could. Lady Colin Campbell adds another layer. Politeness requires that we do not rudely push through a crowd, but we wait to take our proper turn. Whether it be in the entrance hall to a public room, railway carriage or omnibus, or in a shop, library or ticket office. Then she addresses a behaviour that clearly irritated her, a very specific behaviour indeed. In public vehicles and public rooms, it often happens that there is a scarcity of seats for the number of applicants for them. I have constantly seen ladies demand, as a right, silently but yet unmistakably, that some gentleman should yield up his seat, and the coolness with which they treat the kind action, not even troubling themselves to say thank you, almost disturbs the mind. This is fascinating. Here Lady Colin Campbell, who would soon be accused of adultery with 4 men, whose intimate life would be dissected in newspapers, being disturbed by women who don't say thank you for surrendered seats. The scale of transgression seems mildly miscalibrated, but that was precisely the point of these rules. Small violations could be prosecuted with certainty. Large questions of morality and justice? Those were far more complicated. She concludes this section with her vision of graceful sitting. There is such a thing as sitting gracefully. Legs and feet are not to be crossed. Hands and fingers are not to fidget and rub each other on their owner's face, dress, or ornaments. A lounging, lolling attitude cannot be called graceful. Sit perfectly still, react to nothing, maintain composure regardless of absurdity. This was the price of being considered perfect. In her third article, Lady Colin Campbell turns to marriage, and her opening is striking. The outset of married life, the complete and entire freedom from parental control and surveillance, the untried post of ruler of her own actions as well as those of others, which is now hers, often bewilders the girl wife and puts her into a state of flutter and nervousness. She was writing from experience, though not the kind of advice her readers to emulate. In 1886, 2 years after these articles appeared, both Lady Colin Campbell and her husband filed for divorce, an utter scandal in those days. He accused her of adultery with 4 men. George Spencer Churchill, son of the 7th Duke of Marlborough, Sir Eyre Shaw, chief of the Metropolitan Fire Brigade, and Sir William Butler, a noted soldier and author, and finally Thomas Bird, their physician. The trial became the scandal of the century, according to historian Diane Atkinson's The Criminal Conversation of Miss Norton in 2012, which examines Victorian divorce scandals. The Campbell case was unprecedented in its explicit detail. Words like intercourse appeared in the newspapers. The jury visited the Campbells' London home to verify the butler's testimony about witnessing Lady Colin's alleged meetings with men through a keyhole. The incident was so infamous that multiscopes in Great Britain became known as what the butler saw machines. Frank Harris, the notorious editor, reported the case in scabrous detail and received an indictment for obscene libel, though this boosted his newspaper sales dramatically. The trial consumed public attention for weeks, and the verdict? The jury found that neither party had committed adultery. No divorce was granted, and the couple remained legally married but separated until Lord Colin's death in 1895. But in 1884, Lady Colin Campbell was still offering advice on entertaining guests, and her warnings about ostentation are pointed. It is truly laudable to try and give the best we can to our friends, but it is a mistaken notion to think that their happiness and pleasure can be enhanced by any extraordinary effort on the parts of the entertainers. Then she relates what might be the most excruciating dinner party in Victorian literature. Some months ago, I was invited by a strictly formal invitation to an evening at home at the house of some new housekeepers. On arrival, a small maid opened the door, and when we were within, said in a formal phrase, "Ladies upstairs, please, gentlemen in there," pointing to the stairs in the back room as she gave the directions. Having deposited my cloak in the bedroom, which had evidently not been prepared for visitors, I descended and was ushered into a room. It was furnished as a dining room. A large, square table occupied most of the space, and there was but just room for people to move around it. Guests came flocking in, all in full evening attire. The nature of the invitation warranted them in donning it. Very soon there was not standing room, and the hostess said that a leaf of the table had better been taken away. This operation was a difficult matter and caused a disturbance, for there was no other room into which the guests could overflow. Can you just picture this? Formally dressed guests packed into a dining room, giant dresses, watching furniture being dismantled around them because there was no space to stand. After this was accomplished, several of the company were asked to play and sing a piano which was squeezed up into a corner, and then refreshment in the shape of a sweetmeat commonly known as rock was handed round in a glass dish. Then we wished to say our adieus, but were begged to stay a while longer to hear a recitation which was thereupon given by the host. This was the conclusion of the entertainment. A single glass dish of rock candy after formal invitations, full evening dress, and a mandatory recitation from the host. Shocking indeed. Lady Colin Campbell's assessment of it is devastating. It was not the paucity of the entertainment which disappointed our expectations, but the foolish ostentation which prompted our entertainers to attempt an evening party. She notes this occurred in London in the year of 1882, and that the host was a member of one of the learned professions. Education and professional status offered no protection from social failure, nor from being published in a prominent magazine that was distributed to thousands. However, how were women to really understand what was right and wrong when Mrs. Beeton's A Doorstopper of a book was a staple in every home? It would have been on the shelves of many housewives. And Isabella Beeton's standard was significantly higher. She creates a contrast, a vision of what she felt was proper entertaining, and the contrast between her opinion and Lady Colin Campbell's is stark. In The Complete Etiquette for Ladies, which I proudly have on my shelf, Isabella Beeton describes an ideal dinner party. The table was set for 26, and standing on it were elegant gilt candelabra. All of the lights were wax candles. Chandeliers were suspended from the ceiling. In the middle of the table was a magnificent plateau or central ornament of gold. Flowers surmounted the summit, and circular stages below were covered with confectionery, elegantly arranged. On each side of the plateau and above were tall china fruit baskets. In the centre of each basket were immense pineapples of hothouse growth, with their fresh green leaves. Below the pineapples were large bunches of purple and white hothouse grapes, beautifully disposed with leaves and tendrils hanging over the sides of the baskets. Hothouse pineapples in the 1880s were extraordinarily expensive. In fact, I visited Leixlip Castle recently during Heritage Week, and a little nod to this was that in the dining room they had pineapples decorating the windowsills and the tables. It gave me great joy. According to food historian C. Ann Wilson's Food and Drink in Britain in 1991, a single pineapple could cost 50 to 80 pounds in equivalent modern currency when grown in British hothouses. They required specialist glass houses, careful temperature control, and years of cultivation. Dr. Francesca Bowman, in her 2005 study, The Pineapple King of Fruits, notes that pineapples were sometimes rented for display at parties. They were that valuable and that essential to demonstrating status. Mrs. Beeton continues, down each side of the whole long table were placed large, round, saucer-shaped fruit dishes, heaped up with peaches, nectarines, pears, plums, ripe gooseberries, cherries, currants, and strawberries. All the fruits not in season were supplied from hothouses. The cost of this display would have been staggering. According to historian Pamela Sambrook's Country House Brewing in England, 1500 to 1900, from 1996, maintaining a hothouse for out-of-season fruit cost roughly 100 to 200 annually. That's around about £12,000 to £24,000 in modern currency, not including the initial construction costs of around about £500 to £1,000. Mrs. Beeton describes the service as well. Each servant handled the dishes with his white kid gloves and with a damask napkin under his thumb. They offered, mentioning its name in a low voice, a plate of each soup to each guest. White kid gloves for servants wasn't about hygiene. Gloves were regularly replaced during service and added a substantial cost. According to domestic service historian Pamela Horn's The Rise and Fall of the Victorian Servant from 1975, outfitting footmen properly for formal dinners cost employers roughly £10 to £15 per servant annually for livery and accessories. And bear in mind, they would have had several servants at dinner and several servants in the rest of the home. The gap between aspiration and reality trapped the young married woman. As you might know from one of my previous episodes, the art of conversation also trapped the lady into certain things they were allowed to talk about that were either appropriate or inappropriate. Lady Colin Campbell observes, the young married lady is apt to be absorbed in her own personal affairs. Thus, she falls into one stream of talk and babbles continuously about the perfections of her husband, the imperfections of her servant, the superiority of her possessions, her domestic arrangements, their complications and worries, and more than all about the ways and doings of the baby. She's describing the narrowing of the women's world after marriage, but she's also perhaps describing her own impossible position. How could she discuss her husband's perfections when he'd infected her with syphilis? How could she maintain domestic harmony when her marriage was a daily humiliation? Her advice about servants is particularly pointed. Another error into which the young housekeeper falls is that of finding fault with, correcting and directing her servants in the presence of guests. No. Her advice about servants is particularly pointed. Another error into which the young housekeeper falls is that of finding fault with, correcting and directing her servants in the presence of guests. Then she describes another social disaster she'd witnessed. My gravity was sorely tried a few weeks ago by a young hostess at 5 o'clock tea. She had both her maids in the room to wait upon her guests. One managed her duties tolerably well, but the other was untrained and was afraid to venture near the ladies, so the hostess went behind her and guided her about just as one would guide a little child. With her hands on the young servant's arms, the mistress gently pushed her in front of one person and then another, so that they might take off or put on their cups to the tray she held. The hostess physically manoeuvring the servant around the room like a puppet. Would it not have been a more comfortable arrangement if the hostess had handled the cups herself? But that would have been beneath her dignity, or rather beneath what she imagined her dignity required. The performance of status often created more discomfort than the reality of the modest circumstances honestly acknowledged. Lady Colin Campbell concludes with warnings about borrowing. They do not ask their neighbours for money, but are constantly sending to ask for a loan of something or other: coals or candles, tea or milk, saucepans or shawls, patterns or papers. This habit of continuous borrowing is an imperfection. It bespeaks a careless housekeeper, and when repayments are forgotten or their necessity is silently ignored, it shows a lack of principle. As an Irish person, I find this particularly shocking. We would often rely on our neighbours in Dublin and out in the countryside to help us with certain things. We would ask for favours, we would ask for tools, we would also drop in when we needed sugar, milk, or tea. These women weren't careless, they were stretched impossibly thin, trying to maintain appearances on inadequate resources, and oftentimes may have actually been lonely. But acknowledging that reality would in itself be a social failure. There was an impossible standard of the home, and Mrs. Beeton opens her chapter on At Home with a statement that is both sentimental and crushing all at the same time, as only Miss Beeton can. It is said that a home without a woman is not a home at all. It may be as neat and clean as hands can make it. It may be adorned with taste and silk, works of art, sculpture, paintings, books, even flowers, little gems of virtue, knick-knacks, and womanish toys. All the accessories of elegant life may be there, but at best, lacking the presence of a woman, it will only be a kind of refined and luxurious museum. A home without a woman is a museum. A home with a woman becomes a warm, living reality. The burden placed on that woman to transform a space into an emotional haven was enormous. Mrs. Beeton continues, far more than this, all the luxuries of life, all its more expensive refinements may be wanting. There may be no means to procure adornments for it. The furniture may be in the plainest, the homeliest, even taste for its arrangement may be wanting. But if a woman be a true woman, her home will be a bright and happy one. I have to admit I did read this one carefully, because it's rather sinister. No luxuries needed, no refinements, no adornments, even no taste for arrangement. As long as the woman herself is sufficiently sacrificing, the home will be bright and happy. The alchemy required is her emotional labour alone. Mrs. Beeton identifies the three special graces of womanhood as love, hope, and patience. Not intelligence, not capability, nor independence. Love, hope, and patience. She elaborates. She must learn to be loving at home, loving with a kind, unselfish love, showing itself in the little things more than the great ones. She has few opportunities there for great sacrifices, but the call for small acts of self-denial are unceasing, and a spirit of the loftiest self-sacrifice for great sacrifice, for greater opportunities, is often thus acquired by those who cultivate it in these small beginnings. Unceasing small acts of self-denial, preparing oneself for even greater sacrifice. This is the domestic ideal. Hope is but another name for cheerfulness, Mrs. Beeton writes. That if it sees all sombre around, looks forward brightly, and does more than look forward, tries to bring back the missing spirit of joy. The responsibility for household emotional climate rests entirely with the woman. If things are sombre, she must manufacture joy. Lady Colin Campbell returns to her obsession with dress even at home. The remarks I made on dress are equally applicable to the married lady, for she is even more likely to slip into untidy habits. Her morning attire at breakfast often shows want of neatness and nicety. Her evening dress is soiled in the notion that anything will do for homewear seizes hold of her more tenaciously. More especially does she shelter herself under that excuse when children begin to cling to her skirts. Then comes her plea. No, my dear lady, you will miss perfection if you let any excuse serve you for being untidy or dishevelled at any hour. You may have to forego the adornments of brooches and trinkets, of pretty laces and furbelows, for the sake of tiny fingers, but I beseech you, do not lapse into slovenliness, either in your personal attire or in the arrangements of rooms, the freshness and brightness and attractiveness of which depends so much upon you and your supervision. Women must be perfect, even when exhausted, even when overwhelmed by children clinging and hanging from their skirts. When they're struggling financially, they must maintain freshness, brightness, and attractiveness. She concludes, so many Slavans there are already who gradually and yet quickly lose their interest in making and keeping themselves and their homes bright and cleanly. Do not increase the number. The surveillance extended to everywhere. Public spaces, private spaces, even the sanctuary of the home offered no respite at all from judgment. Lady Colin Campbell's divorce trial concluded in 1886 with neither party granted a divorce. But of course, Lady Colin Campbell was socially destroyed. According to George Bernard Shaw, who knew her well, Victorian high society ostracised her completely. But she rebuilt her life with remarkable determination. In 1889, she became art editor for the World newspaper, the first female editor on a London paper not intended exclusively for a female readership. She succeeded George Bernard Shaw in this role. Shaw had recommended her for the position even before they met, and he later wrote that she possessed a lightning wit, a merciless sense of humour, and a skill in journalism surpassing that of any interviewer. He described interviewing her in 1893 and finding that she had such a humiliatingly obvious power of reckoning you up at a glance. It is not possible to express how completely the tables were turned. She wrote under the pen name QED as an art critic and produced a widely read column called In the Picture Galleries. She also wrote travel articles under the pen name Vera Zerdzin, producing over 200 pieces. She became a recognised expert in fencing, studying under the French master Camille Provost, and an adept fly fisher. Her work on freshwater fishing was collected in the Book of Running Brook in 1886. She wrote about cycling, music and theatre, published a children's book, and even exhibited her own landscape paintings. She was a force to be reckoned with. James McNeill Whistler painted her portrait in 1886, calling her his lovely leopard. And the very handsome and exceedingly amiable lady, the painting Harmony in White and Ivory portrait of Lady Colin Campbell, was never finished and later lost. American novelist Gertrude Atherton described her as one of the most beautiful women she had ever seen, quite 6 feet tall and perfectly made, poised and balanced. She reminded her of a spirited, clean-limbed racehorse. Her eyes and her hair were black, her skin a luminous ivory hue. She had no colour save her lips and used no makeup. Unexpectedly, she had a great deal of animation and a keen, satiric, brilliant mind. What a wonderful way to be remembered. Her relationship with Oscar Wilde was less cordial. She famously called him the Great White Slug, though Shaw recorded it as the Great White Caterpillar in his 1918 memoir, noting that Lady Colin Campbell, who hated him, used this description. The insult vividly did describe the tall, imposing Wilde, over 6 feet and heavy set as a pale, bloated creature. When she succeeded Shaw as a critic, she expressed a strong dislike for Wilde's plays, a woman of no importance, and their rivalry exemplified the sharp-tongued competition among the Irish-born wits in the 1880s and 90s in London's literary circles. She was a strong, independent and versatile woman, likely going against what she had written in Cassell's Family magazine. She died at Carlisle Mansions in London on the 1st of November 1911 of chronic rheumatism, having built a remarkable career from the wreckage that would have destroyed most people. The standard that Lady Colin Campbell outlined and the one that Mrs. Beeton reinforced was impossible. Not difficult, impossible. The perfect lady had to maintain flawless dress on limited resources, perform constant emotional labour while suppressing all natural reactions, manage complex social obligations while appearing effortless, and transform inadequate homes into warm havens through sheer force and loving cheerfulness. And she had to do all of this while being constantly watched, constantly judged, and constantly assessed for tiny failures that could announce imperfection and destroy marriage prospects, social standing, and financial security. Lady Colin Campbell knew what happened when you failed to meet the standard. She had experienced the full force of Victorian judgment, had her private life made a public spectacle, was legally married to a man who infected her with syphilis but couldn't divorce him. She was ostracised from the society whose rules she'd written, and yet she kept writing, she kept working. She built a career as a pioneering journalist, art critic, sportswoman, and author. She surrounded herself with the most brilliant minds of her era and earned their genuine respect and friendship. Perhaps that's the real lesson of the perfect lady. Not the rules themselves, which are designed to exclude and control, but the resilience required to survive them. Lady Colin Campbell wrote about perfection from a position of spectacular imperfection, and doing so created something more valuable than any etiquette manual: proof that life continued, that work mattered, and wit and intelligence and determination could build meaning even when everything else had been taken away. The pursuit of perfection destroyed countless women, but some, like Lady Colin Campbell, survived to tell us what a pursuit actually cost. Until next time, may your pins match your dress, may your boots remain free of black lead, and may your imperfections never be witnessed through a keyhole. This has been Vices and Volumes. I'm Avril. Thank you for listening. Creating this podcast is a genuine joy for me, and knowing that you're out there listening and engaging with these stories makes it all worthwhile. If you haven't already, please subscribe to Vices and Volumes on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen, and consider leaving a rating or review. It truly helps the show. You can also follow along on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at Vices and Volumes, or visit vicesandvolumes.com for more information. And please reach out and let me know what you think. I love hearing from you. Thank you for being a part of this journey.